Eureka!
The story so far. Machines don't reduce the energy you need to move things, but they can reduce the force you need. They do this by increasing the distance through which you exert your force. The two simplest machines are the inclined plane and the lever. The principle of the lever states that the longer the arm of the lever to which force is applied, the less that force need be. And now, mechanical advantage and friction. Here are two scientists, Professor A and Professor B. They are both equally strong. And here is a very heavy book about science. We are now going to perform a scientific experiment. We are going to find out which of the two professors can lift the book with the lesser amount of force. First, Professor A. 24 newtons of force. Now, Professor B. Only, what? 6 newtons? Well, there's no doubt about it. Professor B is the winner. You're quite right. It's not fair. Professor B had an unfair advantage. He used a machine, a lever, to give himself a mechanical advantage, in fact. But just how much mechanical advantage did the lever give Professor B? It's easy to work out. Both professors lifted the book to a height of about 10 centimeters. Professor A lifted it straight up. So he had to pull against the full force of gravity, which was pulling the book down. But since Professor B's lever arm was 4 times as long as the arm the book was resting on, he only had to pull with 1/4 the amount of force, 6 newtons instead of 24. In other words, his input force was 6, and his output force was 24. And all you do to calculate the mechanical advantage of a machine is divide the output force by the input force. So Professor B's lever had a mechanical advantage of 4. You'd like us to repeat the experiment, Professor A? You think you can equal Professor B's feat of lifting the book with a force of only 6 newtons? Very well. Professor A is now setting an inclined plane against a block of wood 10 centimeters high. And the inclined plane is 40 centimeters long. Fine. That's 4 times the distance, so it should divide the force he needs by 4, which means that his Newton's spring scale should read 6. What's this? 8 newtons? Well, there it is. Professor B is still the winner with a force of only 6 newtons, thanks to the mechanical advantage of 4 given him by his lever. Whereas with Professor A's inclined plane, we see that he has a mechanical advantage of only 3. Why is this? Why did the inclined plane have less mechanical advantage than the lever? Because of something we've forgotten about till now, the force of friction. Every time something rubs against something else, there's friction. In theory, Professor A should have been able to pull the book up the inclined plane with a force of only 6 newtons. But since friction was pulling in the opposite direction with a force of 2 newtons, the professor's pull had to total 8 newtons. Professor B, on the other hand, was lucky because the amount of friction between the point of the fulcrum and the lever arm is almost 0. So the lever is a more efficient machine than the inclined plane, because the inclined plane is plagued by the demon friction. But friction can be an angel as well, of course. Without friction between the tires of your car and the road, you wouldn't be able to drive. Or stop driving. Just as if there was no friction between the soles of your shoes and the floor.
Eureka!
This unit is divided into 5 programs. The program you're about to see is on the incline plane. Then there's a program on the lever. Next comes mechanical advantage and friction. Then the screw and the wheel. And finally, the pulley. But our story begins with the incline plane. You haven't really got enough force to lift that barrel, have you? How much force do you need to lift it? Well, how much does it weigh? So you'll need at least 800 newtons of force to lift it into the back of the truck. How far is that? About 1 meter? How many joules of energy will it take? Well, figure it out. Energy is the ability to do work. Work equals force times distance. 800 newton meters of work, or 800 joules of work, which is the same as 800 joules of energy. But you still can't lift the barrel. There's something wrong somewhere. Perhaps it's because you have to exert your energy all at once. If only you could load the barrel onto the truck a little bit at a time. If you could slice it into 4. Then you'd have 4 200 newton slices of barrel. And you'd only need 200 newtons of force to lift each one. That's easy, isn't it? You're using your energy more effectively now. You're spacing it out over a longer time. But you don't get anything for nothing. Although your force is cut down to a quarter of what you need to lift the complete barrel, each time you lift a quarter of the barrel, you exert that force through 1 meter. Which means that you lift the 4 quarter barrels through a total distance of 4 meters. What you're winning on the force, you're losing on the distance. It's a sort of trade-off. The greater the distance, the less force you need to exert. Very neat. But you can't go around breaking things into pieces just because they're too heavy to lift. If only you had a machine that would allow you to trade increased distance for decreased effort or force. Here's your machine. Yes, I know it's just a plank, but it's also a machine. Try and get the barrel into the back of the truck now, and you'll see why. Magic, isn't it? No, it isn't. It's exactly the same trade-off you got when you split the barrel into 4. The plank is 4 meters long. Instead of moving the barrel 1 meter by lifting it straight up, you're moving it 4 meters by pushing it along the plank. You only need to push it with about a quarter as much force, with only about 200 newtons instead of 800 newtons. But since moving 200 newtons through 4 meters is the same as moving 800 newtons through 1 meter, it will still take roughly the same amount of energy to move the barrel by either method. That's why we can call the plank a machine. It doesn't reduce the energy you need to do something, but it does help you to use your energy more effectively. You think you've just made a new discovery? Think again. How do you suppose they built the pyramids 5,000 years ago? They didn't actually use a plank, of course, but a ramp of earth, which is exactly the same principle. And you use the same principle yourself every time you stand on an escalator. Because the plank, the ramp of earth, and the escalator are all 3 examples of the same type of simple machine. They are all sloping and they are all flat. So physicists call this variety of machine the sloping flat thing. Well, those aren't the exact words they use. They take the Latin-derived word for sloping, which is inclined, and the Latin-derived word for flat, which is plane, to come up with this phrase. So if you're allergic to elevators, why don't you take the inclined plane? story so far. A machine is something that helps you use your energy more effectively. One of the simplest machines is the inclined plane, which allows you to trade increased distance for decreased effort or force. By doubling the distance you move a thing, you can half the force you need to exert. And now, the lever. If you're sitting on a teeter-totter, looking for someone to teeter-totter with, and then a big fat guy comes along, what do? Do you want to risk it? Now, there's an easy way you could have avoided that. Two easy ways, in fact. You could have either have asked the fat guy to move nearer and nearer to the middle of the teeter-totter until you balanced. Or else, you could have made a little adjustment to the teeter-totter before he sat down on it. And then, you would also have balanced. Both methods really boil down to the same thing. You see that support the teeter-totter is resting on? Well, scientists have a fancy word for that. They call it a fulcrum, which is simply Latin for a support or pivot. Anyway, whether the fat guy moves himself closer to the fulcrum, or whether you move him closer to the fulcrum by moving the teeter-totter, the result is the same. The distance between him and the fulcrum becomes less than the distance between you and the fulcrum. And that's the secret of successful teeter-tottering with people heavier than yourself. Or for that matter, the secret of the successful balancing of any object with any other heavier object. If you want to balance a 100 Newton weight with another 100 Newton weight, you place them both at an equal distance from the fulcrum, let's say 2 meters. But if you want to balance a 100 Newton weight with one that's twice as heavy, you move the 200 Newton weight nearer and nearer the fulcrum until it's in just the right place for the two weights to balance. Now you know how to lift a 200 Newton weight with a force of only 100 Newtons. It looks as if you're getting something for nothing, doesn't it? But you're not. Don't forget that the 200 Newton weight is nearer to the fulcrum than you are. How much nearer is it, in fact? 1 meter? So the distance between you and the fulcrum is exactly double the distance between the 200 Newton weight and the fulcrum. That means that you have to move your end of the teeter-totter exactly twice as far as the weight moves. You exert a force of 100 newtons through 1 meter in order to lift a weight of 200 newtons through half a meter. What you win on the force, you lose on the distance. Sound familiar? Of course. It's precisely the same principle as that of the inclined plane. When you double the distance, you can half the force. This is true whether you're using an inclined plane or a teeter-totter. Only we should stop calling it that, because when we use it to make work easier, it's really another sort of simple machine. It's really a lever. Yes, a lever. You use levers all the time, things that give you leverage. After the inclined plane, it's the commonest simple machine in the world. Even cavemen knew about levers. Not to mention old Archimedes in ancient Greece, who was actually the first person to state the principle of the lever. The longer the arm of the lever to which force is applied, the less that force need be. In fact, he got so excited about this one day that he said, "Give me a fulcrum on which to rest, and I will move the earth." That may have been taking things a bit too far, but at least you now know enough to go down and apply Archimedes' principle of the lever to your teeter-tottering.
Eureka!
The story so far. If you divide the force you get out of a machine by the force you put into it, you will discover the mechanical advantage of that machine. But since every machine involves contact between moving surfaces, its mechanical advantage will always be reduced to some extent by the force of friction. There's a lot of friction involved with the inclined plane, but hardly any with the lever. And now, the screw and the wheel. How many different types of simple machine do you think there are? 2. There are only 2 basic machines, the inclined plane and the lever. These are the mother and father of every machine in the world. All the others are merely variations on the same theme. For example, there's a beautiful machine. No, not your car. The road. Yes, the road. A winding mountain road is a machine, too. Well, suppose the road didn't wind. Suppose it went straight up the side of the mountain. This is a much shorter way to the top, isn't it? And yet, it won't do you much good, because the engine of even your magnificent automobile hasn't enough force to lift your car straight up. But suppose we make the road long enough and the slope gentle enough for you to drive up the mountain with ease. What have we done now? Yes, we've made the road into an inclined plane, a simple machine. But that's an expensive way to go up a mountain. It requires an awfully long ramp. What if we wrap the inclined plane round the mountain instead? Now we're back where we started, with a winding mountain road, which is really an inclined plane in disguise. A twisted inclined plane, if you like. There are twisted inclined planes all over the place. This includes every device that has a spiraling, corkscrewing action, and which allows you to trade extra turning distance for reduced force, either to help you lift things or fasten things together. Here is the commonest example of all, the screw, which is, in fact, the very name which physicists give to every type of twisted inclined plane, the screw. So that's one of the descendants of the inclined plane. Hang on a minute. Can you give me an example of a simple machine that is descended from the lever? Well, you're holding one in your hand right now. Yet another machine that doesn't look like a machine. I know. But have you ever tried to open a door without a doorknob? You haven't got enough leverage, have you? That's where the doorknob comes in. It's a direct descendant of the lever, like this, or this, or this. They're all children of the lever. How come? Well, a long time ago, some very wise men were looking at a lever one day, when they suddenly thought how nice it would be if the extra force the lever gives you to move something from here to here, say 4 times the force, because one lever arm is 4 times the length of the other. They wondered if this extra force could be extended through 360 degrees. In other words, they wondered if they could make a circular lever, a lever that would go all the way round. And while they were at it, they made up a new name, an axle. With its center where the point of the fulcrum used to be, and the short arm of the lever now running from this center to the outside of the axle, and the long arm running from the center of the axle in the opposite direction. Now when you push the lever with a force, say, of 100 newtons, you can turn the whole axle around with a force of 400 newtons. And that's how you're able to open doors and steer cars and ships and pull up anchors with such ease, thanks to the ancient wise men and their circular lever. Yes, congratulations. You've just reinvented the wheel.
Eureka!
The story so far. There are only two basic machines, the inclined plane and the lever. All other machines are variations of these. A screw is simply a twisted inclined plane. A wheel is simply a circular lever whose fulcrum has become an axle. And now, the pulley. The pail of water that Jack and Jill had to fetch was not on top of the hill at all. It was actually at the bottom of a well. Unfortunately, it was too heavy for either of them to pull up. What they needed was a simple machine to give them a mechanical advantage. No, the inclined plane doesn't help. Nor does the lever. Nor the screw. What other sorts of machine are there? Ah, yes, the wheel. But what's Jill doing with it? She is arranging the wheel so that it will revolve on an axle stuck in that post. Very good. Jill's just rediscovered another sort of simple machine. A wheel that instead of being all of a piece with its axle, can revolve freely around an axle. Since this type of wheel is used mainly for pulling things, it's called a pulley. And Jill can hitch the rope around it and use it to pull. No, Jack can use it to try to pull the pail of water up. That's funny. He needs just as much force to try to pull the pail of water up this way as he did trying to pull it up the other way. I wonder if there's a better way of rigging the pulley. Amazing. How did Jill manage it? Both she and Jack only had one pulley to work with, and yet Jill was able to pull up the pail with half the force that Jack needed. Well, when a pulley is set up like this, it's called a single fixed pulley. All it does is change the direction of your pull, but it doesn't reduce the force you need. But when a pulley is arranged like this, it's called a single movable pulley, and it halves the force you must exert, because the pail of water is now, in effect, being lifted by two ropes instead of one. It's as if two people were lifting the pail, and it looks as if we're getting something for nothing again, doesn't it? But of course we're not. If we compare the distance that Jill raised the pail with the amount of rope she pulled, we see that it's the same old story. What she's gaining on the force, she's losing on the distance. The distance that she pulls the rope is twice the distance that she raises the pail. But the way Jill used the pulley is still twice as effective as the way Jack used it. There are lots of other ways of combining pulleys, and it's simple to figure out the mechanical advantage of each system. All you do is count the number of ropes supporting the weight. This single fixed pulley has one piece of rope supporting a weight of 600 newtons. Input force 600 newtons. Output force 600 newtons. And the mechanical advantage is therefore 1. There isn't any mechanical advantage, in other words. This single movable pulley has two ropes supporting the weight. Input force 300 newtons. Output force 600 newtons. Mechanical advantage 2. Here's a system with 3 supporting ropes. Input force 200 newtons. Output force 600 newtons. Mechanical advantage 3. This one also has a mechanical advantage of 3, and is, in fact, the pulley system that Jill finally rigged up for herself. Although she had to pull the rope 3 meters for every meter that she raised the pail of water, she only needed 200 newtons of force to do it. In a sense, she'd become 3 times as strong as Jack. And now you know why Jack fell down and broke his crown.